Episode 3 only showed us about 10% of what really happened when the Hestia Familia was given their mission. There was so much more from the point when they received the letter all the way to when they met the Xenos. I'm talking multiple entire scenes where Belle and the others found themselves in very dire situations. I mean, their entire journey throughout the 19th floor was pretty much a literal underleveled speedrun to the exit. They honestly barely made it out with their lives, and that was something the anime didn't show. So let's take a look at how the Hestia Familia's secret mission should have been. Before we get started though, if you've ever wanted to read the novels for yourself, then now would be the best time to start. Bookwalker is currently having a sale on pretty much every digital DanMachi novel and sequel. So you can get 30% back in coins for volumes 1 to 3 of any of the series, then 15% back for any other volume after that. Plus, if you've never used Bookwalker before, then you can also use code AniNews to get $5 off your first ebook purchase instead. Either way, both are a great discount to use to get started with the novels or manga. Or even if you just want to continue the series from where the anime is, then be sure to use the link in the description before November 17th to access the sale. Now, let's get back to the video. Episode 3, Xenos, covering chapters 4 to 5 of Volume 9 of the light novel. Before the chaotic opening we saw in the guild, we first had a couple cutscenes involving both the Loki and Freya familias. We were given their perspectives on the current situation. As Freya sat in her usual place at the top of Babel Tower, Otter came in to report the sightings of a winged monster, specifically the part about it being taken away by an unknown person. As concerning as it was for there to be a monster in the city, Freya instructed Otter not to interfere, at least not until they got word from the guild. If it truly was a pressing issue, then the guild would have contacted her just like how they did during the invasion. Besides, Freya already knew that she could go to Hermes if she wanted to find out more about what was happening. Not to mention that the guild was still punishing them for having wiped out the entire Ishtar Familia. So any action taken that wasn't specifically ordered by the guild would only end up harming her reputation in Aurario. Don't get me wrong though, it's not like her Familia wasn't capable of rejecting any penalty the guild could give her. It's just that it was important to maintain the image that the guild was in control of Aurario, at least for now. She also didn't want the hassle of having to go up against Loki. That actually would have been a little bit difficult. On the other hand, Loki didn't give any direct orders to her Familia. Instead, Finn went and took action all on his own. He requested anyone that was available to get involved in the hunt for the monster. This was because Finn actually had a deep fondness for the city and its people. So he wasn't going to stand by and do nothing while this monster was roaming the streets. As such, his orders were very simple. Attempt to capture the monster alive, but if it's endangering other people, don't hesitate to kill it. After this is when we get to the scene in the guild. Because the side stories from the invasion arc weren't included, we aren't able to fully understand just how serious the situation really is. Remember, this wasn't the first time that a monster had appeared in the city. In the story involving Sida and Belle at the orphanage, a barbarian minotaur from the lower floors had made its way to an underground tunnel right below Daedalus. So the fact that monsters were more frequently popping up around the surface put into question the very capabilities of the guild. The people of Aurario were starting to reconsider the guild's capacity as a governing body. It was for this very reason that the situation was one that needed to be handled very carefully. Otherwise, the guild could end up losing the trust of its people. As Misha and Aina were frantically discussing the details, Misha first confirmed that all of Ganesha's monsters were still in their cages. Since his Familia was the only one allowed to keep live monsters in the city, it made sense to check with him first to see if any got loose. The thing is, every monster he owned was fitted with a magical tracking plate, one that would instantly notify them had a monster tried to escape. So the fact that none of their alarms went off meant that it wasn't one of their own. What was even more concerning to the guild though was that this monster was actively trying to hide itself by wearing a robe. It made it seem as if the monster was self-aware. And just the notion of any monster having that sort of knowledge was more than enough to make Aina's blood run cold. It was shortly after this that Aina was summoned by the guildmaster. This was the man solely responsible for Aurario's day-to-day affairs. Because he was an elf, he'd been able to work for the guild for well over a century now, making him one of the most important people in Aurario. But he didn't always have the orc-like appearance that he has now though. This shift towards obesity came when he gained the position and power that he currently has now. Because of this, Many elves began to see him as someone who had lost pride in their own race. So eventually they began to criticize him for his lust for money and a lack of humility. It was a level of arrogance that became apparent when he scolded Aina for wasting his time. She was only a couple minutes late, but just the fact that she was made him believe that she thought that she was better than him. Of course that wasn't true, but that's just how arrogant the guildmaster was. It also didn't help that Aina was a half-elf. That's because elves tended to look at half-elves as an inferior race. So it was pretty much expected going into the meeting that she wasn't going to be treated very well. What she didn't expect was for him to comment about how she'd been using her body to seduce adventurers. It was a snide remark in reference to the side story where 2 adventurers began to stalk her. Despite it being a misunderstanding, Aina still felt the shame from the implications of it. But to defend herself would also mean to contradict the words of the guildmaster, and that was something he wouldn't allow. So instead, Aina just stood there and took it. Now, the purpose of this meeting was regarding Aina's relationship with Belle. You see, the guild had found out that Aina had been withholding information about Belle's abilities, specifically the development of Luck and Firebolt. This was something they only knew because they had begun to investigate him. Belle's rapid growth was something the guild could no longer simply ignore. And the fact that Aina never even submitted the details behind how he'd been leveling only went to make the whole thing even more suspicious. For context, the level up model is a document that needs to be submitted every time an adventurer levels, and Aina is responsible for submitting this file for every adventurer she advises. But because she hasn't been doing this, the guildmaster could only assume that she'd been keeping this information a secret in order to protect Belle. Sure, her heart may have been in the right place, but keeping Belle's growth a secret was costing the guild far more than she could ever imagine. The more Royman talked about it, the angrier he became. And the whole situation just devolved into this constant verbal assault on Aina. Only after he calmed down did he finally present her with the letter. When Belle came to receive this mission, the initial shock of learning that the guild already knew about Wine made him begin to doubt everything that he thought he knew. He was no longer certain that he could trust the guild. He wasn't even sure that he could trust Aina. For all he knew, she could have very well been the person that was investigating him. Belle's doubts continued to grow in proportion to the level of panic he was feeling. It was only after he calmed down that he was able to disregard those previous thoughts. Seeing the concern on Aina's face made him realize that she would never betray him. It was absurd to think that someone who supported him like how she has would ever do that. This was a notion that only ended up being further reinforced when Aina got up and offered to hear what was troubling him. She wasn't someone who could do very much, but the least she could do to help was listen. It was a heartfelt plea that Belle had no choice but to ignore. If he didn't, then that would only drag yet another innocent person into the mess he started. So it took every part of his being to push out the words telling her not to worry, making him feel as if he was leaving Aina behind. Now, getting to the 20th floor wasn't as easy as the anime made it seem. You see, adventurers entering a new floor tend to take their time so they can understand the layout and monsters. So the main issue wasn't necessarily their lack of strength, but instead their lack of experience. They didn't have enough time to scope out the floor like how they normally do, thus greatly increasing the risk that came with the mission. The whole thing actually reminded Belle of stories he'd heard from the ancient times, specifically how those who were the first to enter the dungeon were never known as adventurers. Instead, they went by the title of explorers, people who ventured into the unknown to make a discovery. So that's exactly what Belle thought they were going to do. Once everyone had prepared for their mission, their arsenal included a large shield, weapons of every kind, and magic swords. The group also wore a combination of fire-resistant salamander wool and the defense-heavy Goliath robes. When it came time to approach the dungeon, Belle could feel that he was being watched. He wasn't sure whether it was the guild or Hestia Familia, but he knew that there was more than one person monitoring him. Even so, he couldn't let that distract him from the mission. Belle's focus stayed centered on the journey that they were about to embark on, bringing us now to their perilous descent to the 20th floor. As you'd expect, the first 18 floors were nothing unusual. It's everything after that starts to get a little bit challenging. So, while taking their one and only scheduled rest, the group checked their supplies to make sure they had everything they needed. This included Lily's stink bombs and Welf's magic swords. As for their formation, Belle and Welf were in charge of leading. Lily and Haruhime were to support from the middle, and Wine and Mikoto were to watch their backs. The key factor in maintaining this formation though was Haruhime's support. Welf wouldn't be able to lead with Bell unless he had a constant stat boost from Haruhime's Uchide no Kozuchi. The thing is, this was level boosting magic that only lasted for 15 minutes at most. So not only did they need to keep close track of this interval, but they also needed to make sure that Haruhime had enough mana to keep casting it. That's why timing and potions were very crucial here. Now, before we continue with their mission, we were first shown Hestia's encounter with Vels. What the anime didn't include though was the contingencies Hestia set up in the case this turned out to be a trap. You see, as soon as Hestia got the mission, she went and prepared some cautionary measures. The evening before the meeting, she personally went to Mihawk's Familia and requested their protection. She told them pretty much everything except for the parts about Wine. So Mihawk agreed to set up Naza, Cassandra, and Daphne in positions around the meeting place. This was just in case the guild tried to do anything. If they did, then Naza would use her sniper skills to eliminate any threat from afar. But neither Hestia nor Mihawk expected Vels to be able to sense their presence from where he was. So it came as a surprise when he activated a smoke screen to obscure their view. By the time the smoke had cleared, both Hestia and Vels had disappeared from where they were. That's when we find out that Mihawk's Familia wasn't the only one there. Hephaestus and Takema Kazuchi also rushed out from the shadows to see what was going on. As it turns out, Hestia had requested protection from all of them. So all three became rather worried as no one knew where Hestia had been taken. The next scene brings us mid-fight for Bell on the 19th floor. Currently, him and everyone else were surrounded by all sorts of different bug monsters and creatures that looked like Wine. Ever since entering the floor, every single monster they came across had started to attack them super aggressively. So much so that Lily had already been forced to use one of the magic swords to its limits. Welf wasn't particularly upset that Lily was using it, but he was upset by the fact that it was so fragile. As for Bell, he had been forced to use Firebolt much more often than he'd liked. By the time they were halfway through the 19th floor, almost all their potions had already been used. It honestly wasn't a very ideal situation to be in, but having 2 magic swords left did make it a bit more manageable. After fending off another wave, Lily went and told everyone to gather the drop items, but not because she wanted to sell them. It was more to prevent the other monsters from eating them. If they didn't, then the monsters on the way back would be much more challenging. So for any item that couldn't fit in their bag, they tossed it deep into the forest. As they continued further along the path, Mikoto constantly used her skill to detect nearby or approaching enemies. Welf and Lily closely monitored the walls to make sure no monsters were spawning. Then Bell was using this brief moment of peace to admire the scenery. Despite knowing that he could be attacked at any moment, he found that it was helpful to enjoy these moments of serenity. It was one of those things he felt was necessary in order to remain calm. But as he did, Bell once again got the feeling that he was being watched. And this time there were plenty more eyes on him than there was before. Once again though, Bell knew that he couldn't stop moving forward. So he continued. After a bit more walking, the group eventually came across a giant wall of mushrooms that was blocking the path. This was strange because the map didn't indicate any sort of obstruction. It looked as if they were supposed to continue directly through it. As they made their approach to investigate, that's when the wall quickly turned into a gigantic unit of monsters. They were creatures known as dark fungi that used their appearance to blend in with the forest around them. And because Mikoto had never encountered them before, she wasn't able to detect them with her skill. Their attacks consisted mainly of explosive poison gas. Luckily, Bell's firebolt proved to be effective at dispersing it. After over 9 uses, Bell was eventually able to get rid of most of the gas and burn the wall. But that wasn't the only monster there. As soon as the mushrooms crumbled into ash, a battle boar appeared from behind it alongside a horde of numerous other creatures. Welf rushed in with his shield to stop the boar right in its tracks, a feat he was only able to accomplish by being boosted to level 3. But because he had to rush forward to where the mushrooms were, he also ended up getting poisoned by the lingering gas. Now, although Mikoto and Bell were up there with him as well, they both possessed the advanced skill immunity. It didn't completely nullify the effects of the poison, but it did make it bearable enough to the point where they didn't have to use a potion to heal it. Welf, on the other hand, was in dire need of one. So Lily pulled out one of the few remaining in her backpack. The others all shared a half potion just to be safe. After defeating the horde, There was only a brief moment of peace before everyone began to hear a buzzing sound. Almost immediately, Belle recognized it as the hum of deadly hornets. These were very dangerous monsters typically found on the 22nd floor and below. Just like how the killer ants were known for being the novice killers, these hornets were known for being the upper-class killers. They were specifically notorious for being able to kill level 2 adventurers almost instantly. That's just how dangerous their stingers were. So, facing off against a horde of 20 was something Belle knew they couldn't handle. Running away was their only option. As they did, panic began to rise as the buzzing drew closer and enemies could be seen approaching from the front. Belle and Mikoto had no choice but to charge forward and clear the path. Since keeping the group moving was all that mattered, their planned formation was in shambles as everyone kept pushing forward. Not a single moment could be wasted on stopping. Fortunately, they were still on the path to the 20th floor. They just had to keep going straight. But to make things worse, cracks began to appear all throughout the walls in front of them. Everyone was shocked to see that a massive horde of monsters was being born right in front of their eyes. At least 44 could be counted from Mikoto's skill, and that wasn't even including the 20 hornets chasing them from behind. But rather than stop and go a different direction, Welf yelled for everyone to keep moving forward. So they trusted his words and charged even faster towards the horde of monsters in front of them. It was after getting close enough that Welf brought out his magic sword and swung it with one swift motion, causing a massive wave of flames to engulf the area that the monsters were spawning. In only an instant, the entire area had been turned into a smoldering gorge of ash. Not a single sign of life remained, and because the area was still so hot, everyone had to hold their breath while running through it in order to avoid burning their throats. Unfortunately, that heat wasn't enough to slow down the hornets though. The chase continued until everyone jumped into the hole that marked the entrance to the 20th floor. As the hornets followed closely behind, Welf used the last remaining attack of his magic sword to burn everything behind him, wiping out all the hornets and whatever else may have been chasing them as well. That was how their descent to the 20th floor should have been. An actual life-threatening adventure that they barely made it out of. Now, when we switch back to Hestia, her encounter with Ouranos gave us a lot more information than what was shared in the anime. For starters, Ouranos' divine authority stood in a league of its own. He was one of the few deities that could be referred to as a supreme god, making him one of the most influential people in Gekkai. That said, Ouranos wasn't someone that Hestia was well acquainted with. In fact, the two hadn't seen each other in well over 1,000 years. The only things Hestia knew about him were from stories she'd heard from others, specifically the ones about him being the father of Aurario. Since Ouranos was one of the first deities to descend upon the world, he was a key factor in bringing an end to the ancient times. Him and his children worked together to plug the hole of the dungeon and build the guild. But it was after that job was done that Ouranos decided to maintain a stance of neutrality. Rather than give his familia a Valna, he instead decided to give them political power. That way the guild would only ever be a governing body. Aside from that, Hestia also knew that Ouranos' personal divine authority was what kept the dungeon in check. His immense will and constant prayers were the only thing preventing monsters from reaching the surface. So it was using this information that Hestia was able to figure out where she was taken. This was a secret place underneath the guild known as the Chamber of Prayers. I mean, it was the only place that made sense given the circumstances. In any case, the majority of their conversation was pretty much the same. So now we can switch back to Belle's exploration on the 20th floor. As they wandered deeper into the caves, Belle no longer felt like he was being watched. Whoever was tailing them had completely vanished the moment they entered the floor, bringing us now to the discovery of the hidden cave. But before encountering the Xenos, the anime didn't show that they first came across a pond. It was the only thing remaining at the end of the tunnel, a seemingly dead end that led to nowhere. But upon closer investigation, Haruhime noticed a small opening under the water. She couldn't tell exactly where it went, but it did look to lead to somewhere else. So Haruhime took the initiative and jumped in to investigate it first. As it turns out, her childhood with Mikoto actually made her quite the skilled swimmer, so she was able to easily find a path to the other side. Since this was the only way to go, everyone took off their equipment and armor and prepared themselves for the swim, only bringing with them the most essential items. When they got to the other side, what they found was none other than what's called Frontier, the term used to describe a place that no one has ever been before, an area of the dungeon that no adventurer had ever set foot in. Now, considering that any type of monster could have been waiting for them, everyone was very tense as they cautiously proceeded forward. It wasn't so much the danger of being attacked that worried them, though. It was instead the danger of encountering the unknown. Not knowing what to expect at any moment was the leading factor causing them so much stress. When they finally encountered the Xenos, most of it was pretty much the same. But the anime did make one slight change that was actually fairly important. Bell wasn't standing still when he was charging his Argonaut ability. Although this may not seem like a big deal right now, it's actually a very significant upgrade. You see, up until now, being stationary had always been one of the prerequisites for using it. But this time Bell had forcibly evolved it so that he could power it up while moving. Not only does this leave him less vulnerable to attack, but it also enables more power since he can charge it while in the motion of attacking. It's quite the significant improvement to Argonaut. Anyway, that was the majority of what was cut from the Hestia Familia's mission. The only other thing worth mentioning is that the name Xenos comes directly from the gods themselves. It's a word used by them to describe those who are heretics, existences that are anomalies expunged from the established system. It's a very fitting name considering what it refers to. But yeah, that was pretty much it for episode 3. Now, before I go, don't forget that you have up till November 17th to access Bookwalker's sale on all the DanMachi novels and manga. Plus, if you pre-order volume 15 before November 30th, then you can also get a bonus digital illustration as well. So feel free to use the link in the description to continue the DanMachi series today. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!